Podcept, the podcast from Deutsche Bank Research, with interviews on current economic and financial topics. Listen as economists and analysts from Deutsche Bank present their views.
So, which are the world's cheapest and most expensive cities? Where will the pound or euro or dollar in your pocket go furthest? Where's the best place to live, eat, and go on a date? I'm Adrian Cox, and I'm here with my colleague Jim Reid, who's recently published the latest edition of his definitive Mapping the World's Prices report for the Deutsche Bank Research Institute. Jim, you've been mapping global prices for over a decade now. This year, the report highlights some dramatic structural shifts. What do you think was the biggest surprise for you?
I think the biggest surprise in the report generally is how much prices have moved relative to each other around the world in the last 6 or 7 years, really. We all think about globalization as something that should kind of make prices converge and be very uniform across the world. But it isn't like that at all. You have taxes, you have regulation, you have FX move, you have inflation move, even tariffs more recently. And there are big differences in prices around the world. And I think the biggest surprise in this year's report really is just how cheap Tokyo is now and how cheap Japanese cities are more generally. I suppose other highlights, Tel Aviv has slowly climbed the ranks and it's now rivaling the likes of Geneva and Zurich and the US cities as being one of the most expensive. And I suppose the other big mover is Central Europe, which has seen a massive increase in recent years, and it's really starting to be a more normal European price level now.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is fascinating what it says about Tokyo because it does look genuinely cheap by developed market standards. iPhone's cheapest there. I think a meal is about a third of what it would cost in New York. Is this the investment story of the next decade? Any chance that AI could play some kind of a role in reversing this? Yeah,
look, cycles tend to come and go. So when we first did the report in 2012, the US was very, very cheap. And, I'd like to think you might have looked at that report on reading it and thought, I must increase my exposure to the US now. And at that point, Japan was very, very expensive. So we've come full circle, really, in the 14 years since we first wrote this report. And now the US is very expensive. And Japan is astonishingly cheap, really. And it feels like it's just come at a time when, currency traders, bond investors, if not given up on Japan, have kind of got slowly bored of waiting for the story to turn. So, I do think you'll look back at this point and see it as pretty cheap. And, as you said, it's eating out, it's consumer goods, cheapest place in the world to buy an iPhone. So it's across the board, really. And if I had to kind of give you a couple of stats to explain the reason why. Since we first published in 2012, the yen has fallen 51%, which is a big drop. And normally, if a currency falls that much, it's because you've got runaway inflation. But actually, since 2012, Japanese prices are only up 20%. So 51% decline in the currency, only 20% rise in prices is a big part of why Japan now looks very cheap.
And then you also mentioned Tel Aviv, which I think has seen a remarkable surge. I mean, it's become one of the most expensive cities for everything from a McDonald's to a new car. Is this just about the war in the Middle East, or is there some kind of a bigger picture going on under the surface?
I think maybe there's a touch of geopolitics to this story, but I think it's mostly an FX story. The shekel has performed very well in recent years, but it's also been an economic story. The defense sector has been booming for obvious reasons. The tech sector in Israel has been booming. And I think that's helped the economy. It's got a fair amount of inflows and steadily it's been climbing the rankings. And I suppose this year you're starting to crack into kind of top 5, top 3, or even top 1 when it comes to McDonald's. So it probably attracts a bit more attention this year.
So what about the major financial cities, London, New York, Paris, some of the great Asian cities? Where do I need to move to get a pay rise and where will my money go furthest?
Yeah, the awkward truth is that some of the biggest financial hubs, although they have the highest salaries, tend not to have the highest disposable income. So as you say, New York is the highest prices for rent, so very high salaries, but that gets eroded. So a lot of the big cities will take from you, even if they give. if you look at the likes of Zurich and Geneva, they're probably the sweet spot. Although the cost of living is very high, salaries are also high. So when we net out for disposable income and taxes, Zurich and Geneva actually come out top. And the likes of London, New York don't make the top 25 when we're looking at disposable income.
Right. And then obviously something that people point the finger at with the big global cities is whether they're livable or not. And often people would say they're not. Luxembourg, top of the charts when it comes to livability again this year. But it also looks as though there's been an interesting rise of the German cities, places like Munich and Frankfurt really coming up into the top 10. What does this tell us about Germany and about Europe's economic engine?
Yeah, but when we look at the German cities, they're not actually top at many of the individual components, but they are quite consistent across the board. So, when we look at the quality of life index, it's very subjective. Other people would have a different weighting or a different measurement for what qualifies as a good quality of life. But when we look at things like, housing costs, pollution, commuting times, affordability of housing, purchasing power, etc. What we tend to find is that Frankfurt and Munich are pretty good all-rounders at all of those, and that actually gets them. For the first time, Munich is in the top 5, and Frankfurt is just outside. So maybe Frankfurt isn't everyone's number one choice to live in, but actually, it probably should be on your radar if you want a decent quality of life. And actually, one of the interesting things is that if you look at the combination of cities that are in the top 10 of quality of life and disposable income, so that could be a bit of a sweet spot. The cities are Luxembourg, Copenhagen, Frankfurt, Geneva, and Zurich. So those are your 5 sweet spots. And it's interesting, there's not a single US city that combines quality of life and disposable income.
Yeah, it's interesting. Another theme, actually, which just relates to a little bit further to the east, is this great convergence that you note, which is happening in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. So cities like Prague and Warsaw and Budapest, your quote here was, they're no longer the obvious bargains that they once were. Does that mean that, for investors and tourists, this is the end of, cheap weekend trips and a potential kind of unexpected upside in investment?
Look, definitely the era of the bargain is over in those cities, and the gap has narrowed to the more Western European cities, if that makes sense. And that's because wages have gone up. It's probably in the last decade, Central and Eastern European wages have been the biggest climber. Investment has gone up. You have more and more EU integration, and you've had higher inflation, which have all helped. I don't think the investment story is over. It's just matured. So I think you have to go into it slightly with your eyes open, and there are still potential relative to the rest of Europe, but it's not as wide as it once was. And some of that is good for locals because it's obviously helped purchasing power as well. It's less good for British stag and hen do's, I think, but that's probably better for civilization. So maybe we should all be thankful for that.
Right. Now, the US, obviously we have to talk about the US. Last year we discussed potential peak US. This year it seems though that the verdict is a little bit mixed. So on the one hand, New York rents are still number one globally, but it does look as though there's been a bit of a slip in San Francisco house prices. Is the US starting to lose that top spot in pricing power?
I think if you squint at the data, you can see that the US is just right at the top of that cycle, and looks like it's just maybe flexing down a little bit in terms of prices. But as you said, New York is still well ahead of everyone else in terms of rents. But the cost of living means that, as I say, disposable income in a lot of big US cities is not as high as you might expect, and there's a real cost of living issue there. Some of the second tier cities like Boston actually score reasonably well for the US, and that's comes up as a pretty good combination of livability and disposable income. And you're right, San Francisco property prices have actually been declining for probably a decade, steadily, but for a decade. So it probably shows you more of a pricing at the start being very high than than anything else, and maybe proof that the tech boom doesn't necessarily automatically mean higher prices. So I think of the US always as a cyclical story. If you look at the dollar, over the last 50 years, it tends to swing over 7-year cycles between very expensive and very cheap. And my gut feeling is we're probably riding just the top of that peak at the moment, with maybe the risk of it slowly fading over the next few years.
Right. Speaking of very expensive, we've talked a little bit about the Swiss cities. The cheap date index is one of the kind of perennial favorites for readers of the Mapping the World's Prices report. Feels like if you want to go out in Geneva and Zurich on a date, it's going to be extremely expensive, perhaps 5 times as much as it would be for a date in Delhi with more or less the same purchases. What's going on there? What does it tell us about the real world cost of living in these different cities?
Our cheap date index always gathers a lot of attention, I think, alongside probably the quality of life. I think our readers and our viewers are quite romantic at heart, so I think that's probably the reason. Jokes aside, I think what I like about the cheap date index is it combines a lot of everyday items. So buying a pair of jeans, buying a dress, transport to the date, having a meal for 2 in a restaurant, having a bottle of wine, going to the cinema, and then a taxi home. So it combines a lot of elements, and you get a nice all-round feel for how expensive a city is. And yeah, as you say, Geneva and Zurich are at the top spot. And actually, interestingly, Tel Aviv has crept up to be, rivaling Geneva and Zurich. And actually, if you swap out the meal for 2 for a McDonald's, it would get even closer, and it might even pip to the top spot. I'm not sure you'll get a second date though if you swap out the meal for 2 for a McDonald's. So that's one thing to be aware of.
But what if you wanted to impress your date with something really expensive, like an iPhone or a pair of jeans? Is that same cities, or is there a different mix?
Yeah, again, you'd expect uniform items like an iPhone or a pair of jeans to be very similar in price around the world. But I think this is one area where, taxes, tariffs, local pricing differentiation, the competitive market and the FX really, play a part. So Japan is the cheapest place in the world to buy an iPhone at the moment. South Korea is very cheap because they've obviously got the competition from Samsung. So Apple have to have competitive pricing. If you go away with your partner for a week or a weekend in Turkey, don't lose your iPhone, because that is 2.5 times the price that it is in the US. So I would desperately try not to buy an iPhone in the beautiful city that is Istanbul.
Another really popular feature of the Mapping the World's Prices Index is the Oasis Index. What is that?
The Oasis Index is basically the cost of cigarettes and alcohol. So that is really the index that also covers a lot of how governments tax and regulate alcohol and cigarettes. So what we find in it is that Australia and New Zealand are by far the most expensive place to watch an Oasis concert if you wanted to partake in cigarettes and alcohol. Both countries have very high taxes on those products, and the likes of London, Dublin are also pretty high. So that is something where the hand of government is quite clearly on.
Yeah, and then taking a step further back now as we come to the end, what does all of this mean for investors? What are the big secular trends they should be looking at? Is this about shorting the dollar and US assets and buying up the yen and Japanese government bonds? What should people really be taking away, big picture?
Yeah, but I think on anything that looks at relative prices around the world, I think we all know that this is not going to immediately affect the way people trade. These tend to be slow-moving forces that operate in the background, which I'm pretty confident over a 3 to 5 year period will definitely give you a sense of where mean reversion is going to occur. So I look at Japan now and Tokyo, And I'm pretty convinced that will mean revert, because where you tend not to see mean reversion is when you've got a real fundamentally bad story, which is arguably getting worse. And I don't really see that with Japan. If anything, the momentum is actually in favor of Japan relative to where it has been. So the fact that it's so cheap, I think, is a secular story. And the US, as I said earlier, the US has tended to go in cycles of cheapness and expensiveness. So I see the US very much as a cyclical story. And therefore, when you're at the top and peak expensiveness, it feels like there's more probability of that becoming cheaper over the years ahead. And, likes of India, I think, will eventually climb these rankings because India is phenomenally cheap and India has a huge amount going for it in the next few years and decades.
Yeah, well, speaking of the next few years and decades, looking ahead, long-term trends, we've got a cheap yen, a strong shekel, a squeeze on some European housing. What's your boldest prediction for 2030, for the 2030 edition of Mapping the World's Prices? Which city is poised to be the biggest climber, which could be heading for a fall?
2030 combines takes us to the next World Cup. So maybe London will be the epicenter of the world after the World Cup win in 2030. We're recording this shortly after the Argentina loss, so maybe that is a bit unrealistic. On a serious note, I do think, without repeating myself, I think we'll look back most at the Tokyo story and see this as a cheap entry point for all things Japanese. And I think we'll probably see it as peak US. And I think we'll see Indian cities climb the rankings. You might argue, will Swiss cities start to mean revert? But I think the interesting thing about the Swiss cities is that they've been top or near the top all the time we've been doing this study since 2012. And if you go back 50 years, Switzerland is the only country in the world that's managed to keep annual average inflation below 2% since the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971. So you've pretty much got 55 years of sound money in Switzerland, and therefore I would imagine in 2030 the Swiss cities will still be pretty much at the top.
So let's finish off with a quick fire round. What's the best place to buy a holiday home?
Well, I would say if you're marrying scenery, climate and cost, it's really hard to beat Cape Town, actually. If we look at our study, Hong Kong, which is top, is about 15 times more expensive per square metre. What's
the most expensive place to use public transport?
Oh, well, London is so much more expensive than everybody else, well clear of the second place. And actually at the other end, Luxembourg is completely free. So that's the spread.
What's the best place to enjoy a leisurely coffee or a glass of wine?
Well, actually, you can get both in Rome and be in the cheapest 5 cities on both. So I can't think of a better place to have a cappuccino and then a glass of wine watching the sun go down than in Rome.
What's the most expensive place in the world to buy an apartment?
It's still Hong Kong. Hong Kong has dropped about 10% since COVID, but it's still clear of Zurich and Geneva. And just to give you an example, on a square metre basis, it's 15 times more expensive than Cape Town.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you for listening and watching. You can find the full report and many more on our Deutsche Bank Research Institute website. And you can subscribe to be the first to get reports on geopolitics, macroeconomics, technology, and the corporate landscape straight to your inbox. Thank you again.
Podcept, the podcast from Deutsche Bank Research. This podcast has been produced by Deutsche Bank and may contain research as defined in MiFID II. The information discussed is believed to be reliable and has been obtained from public sources believed to be reliable, although Deutsche Bank makes no representation as to its accuracy or completeness. Opinions, estimates, and projections discussed constitute the current judgment of the speaker at the time of recording. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Deutsche Bank and are subject to change without notice. For further important information, please visit research.db.com.